alternative approaches are needed to deal with this issue of the produced water, and this brings with it the idea of not injecting it underground, of releasing it into the environment in some other way. It brings a host of sociological, regulatory, and technical issues. And so any of the alternatives are going to probably require some sort of treatment process because the water, again, is this mixture of different things that are not necessarily useful for whatever it is. If you want to use it for an actual purpose, it's going to have some kind of treatment. And so the governors formed this Water for 2060 Produced Water Working Group to try to find alternative beneficial uses for the water, such as industrial uses and also crop irrigation. Okay. And so, the idea, so the easiest and most obvious thing to do with it is to reuse it in other oil and gas applications. The oil and gas industry, as I mentioned before, they're not necessarily, one of the things they do with it is for secondary recovery, where they're just trying to pressurize the formation. You don't necessarily need really good water for that. Fracking, there are issues about the quality of the water does impact that, but the salinity is not necessarily a non-starter the way it would be in a lot of other applications. One of the problems with using it in the oil and gas industry is that every company is going to have their own way that they might want to do fracking. They pull that produced water out of the ground. It's going to contain some sort of signature of what they did. And so they're not necessarily going to want to share that water with some other company that could then figure out what they're doing. So there are issues associated with using it in the oil and gas industry. But the salinity is not a big issue. And the idea then this would be a way to reduce the amount of fresh water that gets brought in for these other purposes. So that's probably the most obvious thing to do with it. Other possibilities, agriculture is the biggest user of water, but the salinity is a major non-starter. So if we're going to use it for agriculture, you're going to have to find some way to desalinate that water in most cases. The idea of either farmers, the producers that are using the water, probably not going to be real keen on oil and gas wastewater, putting that out on their property. The people that might be consuming the food products are probably not going to be real excited about the idea of eating food that was grown with oil and gas wastewater. Groundwater is cheap. Groundwater is available, so why would a farmer want to take a risk on something like this? So this is a sort of sociological and legal issue as much as a technical one, looking at that. You also, if you want to just release it into a surface water body or to a groundwater, you need some sort of permission from the regulatory agencies. Traditionally, produced water has been thought of as a waste product, so there are legal issues that have to be dealt with to use it in that application. Any of the alternatives are likely to require some sort of treatment. And the biggest issue from a technical perspective is dealing with the salinity. The other things, they're there and they're issues, but they can be removed. But removing really high levels of salt from water is expensive, costs a lot of energy. So here's a graph looking at, I found a paper by one of my colleagues at OU, Kyle Murray, who's a geologist down there, and he did some really nice work looking at the amount of water that gets used and produced by the oil and gas industry. And so this is showing across the 2000 to 2011 how much water got used for those vertical drilling operations and also for the horizontal drilling. And you can see that the big driver in the amount of water that got used is this horizontal fracking volume. So in 2011, we were up to 13,000 acre-feet of water that was used for drilling. So that's one possible place you could use it, is another oil and gas operation. So part of that analysis found that about 3.7, the median value, every formation at every point in time is going to have some difference in the amount of water that gets produced relative to the oil. This is about 3.7 barrels of water produced per barrel of oil back in 2011. So if you wanted to take it all and use it for oil and gas, you need to have a match between supply and demand. So you're producing water, and then you're also going to use water in the oil and gas operations. So those two amounts need to be kind of similar if you wanted to really make the problem completely disappear. So about 13,000 acre-feet used per year for hydraulic fracturing, but we get about 105,000 acre-feet per year of produced water. So that means that even if we recycled every single bit of that, we still have lots of extra water we have to do something with. Okay. Yeah, so it's also used in the secondary recovery, but there are issues with accounting. We don't know exactly how much water is used in those secondary recovery processes that are used to pressurize the formation. But the main message here is that we're probably going to have to do something else with this, with the rest of that water, that we can't just reuse it all for oil and gas. But we want to use as much of it as possible for oil and gas purposes. There are other logistical challenges for recycling. Water is heavy. Moving polluted water around brings a lot of regulatory issues. So if you want to move water from one place to another, that's going to be expensive. And so when things are far apart, that could be a problem. And that's an area where I think there's definitely more research that needs to be done to try to figure out how to match the supply and demand in the recycling. But ultimately, even though it sounds like a lot of water, the oil and gas industry only uses about 1% of Oklahoma's water. So, but eventually we're going to have to look at other options. Thinking about this from the long-term 2060 perspective, we can't just reuse it all in oil and gas. That's not going to be a complete solution. So, so the working group, I recently got asked to sit in on it, and it's being chaired by CH2M, which is a consulting company, and they've done some preliminary analysis, and I thought I would give you a little bit of information about what they were looking at. This preliminary analysis was intended to look at things that are feasible in the short term, and so this did not consider agricultural use or discharge to groundwater because of the regulatory issues and the cost issues. Yeah, one of the things that they wanted to look at is, can we build some infrastructure? Can we put in pipelines to decrease the costs? Pipelines are way more efficient than trucks. They're also, I think, safer in general, although they create other issues with people not wanting to have the pipelines on land. But so could we get everybody together, build some infrastructure to help get the produced water out of one place into another? That was one of the main things that they were looking at. Looked at 10 different cases. Tried to estimate the existing injection case and came up with a cost number for each of these 10 cases. I'm not going to go over all 10 of them, but it started out with a baseline case of what it costs now to inject it. Looked at a case where you reuse it for oil and gas with a absolute minimal level of treatment without trying to remove the salt. And that was assuming that there was some infrastructure in place to try to say, well, if this infrastructure was there, would it be cheaper? Would this help facilitate recycling within the industry? Looked at a situation where you evaporate the water off. That by evaporating it, you're not necessarily creating new water that's available, but at least you don't have to inject it underground. And then looked at some desalination cases for electric power and surface discharge options. And all their cost estimates are based on quotes from companies. So the numbers that I have are not broken down by specific details, but in any case, these are the main producing formations here in Oklahoma. So you have the Mississippi Lime. That's been a producing area for a long time. A lot of the shale boom has been associated with the Scoop and the Stack regions here. Then there's also operations further out here in western Oklahoma. And so this is a map of the salinity. And so the darker it is, the more saline the water is. So the Mississippi Lime formations here are really, really salty. The salinity tends to be lower out here in southwestern Oklahoma. So this is a place where it would make more sense thinking about desalinating the water, reusing it for agriculture. Kind of makes more sense out here where the water is not so salty than it does up here. But this is where a lot of the volume is coming from. And a lot of the demand for the fracking is in here. So. Okay, so these are some major water users within the state. One of the options we looked at is, could we substitute it for other freshwater sources? The darker the county is associated with the amount of produced water that's coming up with the oil and gas. Okay, so these are some preliminary results. Again, there are 10 cases. I just picked a few of them. So your baseline case, it costs about $1.83 to inject the water now. If there was infrastructure in place, based on this somewhat preliminary analysis, it looks like it would only cost 57 cents a gallon for them to reuse it. So this is something that would make a lot of sense as far as reducing the amount of injections, would just be to try to build some infrastructure and reuse it for other oil and gas companies. This case here with the intra-county transfer, this is looking at moving water from the Mississippi Lime up here in the north where lots of water gets produced, down here to the scoop area where it's needed for the fracking. This was also cheaper, but this would require some sort of pipeline infrastructure, which would cost, possibly hundreds of millions of dollars. These evaporation cases, I showed two of them here, two different salinities. So in the southwest, the salinity is not as high as it is in the Mississippi lime. Doesn't have a huge difference on the cost because the cost to evaporate, it's mostly driven by the amount of energy it takes to evaporate the water, so that doesn't depend on the salinity very much. Desalination is going to get more expensive. The more salty it is, the more energy you need to use to separate the water from the salt. But these technologies are more expensive. But so this is where the future is probably going to have to be if we're going to completely eliminate this. But they're more expensive right now, so there's more research needed. Challenges to adoption of produced water reuse. So there's a lot of issues. There's the cost to transport and treat the water. There's a question of who owns the produced water. This is something that's traditionally a waste product. One company owns it. Suddenly, there's no regulatory structure in place for them to sell water from one company to another. That doesn't exist. If somebody was to sell the water and then that person spilled it, there's a question of legal liability. This is something that companies are risk averse. They're not going to want to do this. There are issues with right-of-way. If you want to build a pipeline, that may reduce the overall risk of spills relative to trucking the water, but nobody's going to want to have a wastewater pipeline running through their property. So how do you deal with that issue? And then if you wanted to discharge it to surface or groundwater, currently that's not allowed, so new regulations would be needed. Even if it was treated, that's going to have to come. Yeah, so again, if you wanted to build a pipeline, you get this not in my backyard issue. Any of these reuse scenarios for oil and gas are going to cost a lot of capital up front. The market is very volatile. Prices go up and down. There may not be production in some place in 5 or 10 years. The industries don't necessarily know this. So making a big capital investment, it's a difficult sell. Okay, so the recommendations, again, the preliminary recommendations from the group, and this is still under review, so that, if anybody has thoughts, we can pass those along. But so, regulations and laws are needed to facilitate reuse. So the initial analysis indicates that the Mississippi lime water in the north, moving that down to the stack for fracking, that could work from an economic point of view. So more study is probably needed there. Evaporation looks like it's not that much more expensive than the injection alternative. So more work is needed there. Try to think about, what is the benefit of not injecting the water, the reduced seismicity compared with the costs, the marginally more expensive evaporation option. And so it's necessary to try to get all the companies and all the different regulatory agencies together to figure this out. And so the last one I added in, and I think it's really important that we engage with university experts, and that was something that was specifically mentioned, to look at technical issues with treating the water, and also with the logistics, with the social acceptance, et cetera, et cetera.